All right, we want to talk a little bit here about hemodynamics, and these, hemodynamics are basically the factors that affect blood flow. First up, I usually like to start out by trying to define a few different terms that you'll hear thrown around here, and sometimes students get a little bit confused about what they actually mean. First up, blood flow. Blood flow basically is the movement or the flow of blood. Now, you have to keep in mind kind of what we talked about, rather some things that we mentioned in physics. And, when we look at blood flow, blood that is, move from certain sets of vessels, from arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules to veins. And according to physics, flow or movement of any fluid, like blood, will always be from an area of higher to lower pressure. So we can't really lose the association that we have with that pressure difference, moving from high to low pressure, that is, and the fact that that is what drives flow, because that pressure difference is why blood literally flows. Now, when we also consider the flow of blood, we have to also consider something called resistance. Resistance is literally the resistance that your body specifically, more so specifically, I guess, your blood vessels have to blood moving. And that resistance is imparted by blood making contact with the wall. In physics, they usually refer to it as, or you may commonly call it, friction. You see, what happens is, as blood moves along the surface of a blood vessel's wall, that interaction creates friction. In physics, they usually say something to this effect. Two surfaces interacting with each other exert equal and opposite forces on one another. If you wanted a literal physical example, you could take a pen and begin to roll that pen across the surface of a table, for instance. And at some point, if you don't roll it too hard, that pen will ultimately stop. Why is that? Because although the pen may be moving in one direction, the surface of the table is interacting with the pen to try and force it and move in the opposite direction. And that's exactly what's happening when we consider blood moving through a blood vessel. As blood moves or flows in one direction, the blood vessel's walls try to make that blood flow in the opposite direction. Now, key point to remember here. Only the blood that interacts with that wall experiences the resistance that wall imparts. So if that blood is moving kind of toward the center of the vessel, well, the reality is it moves like the walls just don't exist. So it doesn't impart resistance. So resistance, that is the force that must be overcome in order to maintain blood flow. And essentially, when we start to consider your blood pressure, which is the force that is pushing blood forward or making it flow, your blood pressure has to be high enough to overcome the resistance that your body creates in order to make blood continue to flow. Now, I know that's a lot of different terms, but hopefully it starts to kind of come together for you. So I'll say it one more time. Your blood pressure has to be high enough to overcome the resistance that your body creates in order to make blood flow. And that means just simply to move. Now, there's another term that we usually throw in with this discussion involving hemodynamics, and that's velocity of blood flow. And I'm guilty of using velocity and blood flow kind of interchangeably, but technically velocity doesn't relate just simply to blood flowing. It actually means the speed with which the blood is flowing. And that can change also. Typically what we see is the higher the pressure, not only the greater the flow, but also the higher the velocity of the flow. So we're talking or looking at the relationship between pressure, resistance, flow, and velocity of flow. That's kind of what all is wrapped up here with this hemodynamic discussion. Now, like I kind of told you a few moments ago, we'll start, let's just mention here at least pressure to begin with. Blood pressure is determined by several different parameters within the human body. We'll first start out with the blood vessel side of things. The pressure is in part determined by the size of the vessels. When vessels are constricted, blood pressure will be higher. When vessels are dilated, blood pressure will be lower. That pressure can also become altered due to the elasticity of the vessels. Elasticity allows for these vessels to stretch and recoil. And without that elasticity, they become basically kind of fairly static in their size. So if the vessel is static and it doesn't have the ability to constrict and dilate, it may lead to an overall higher pressure due to a lack of that vessel being able to dilate or get bigger. But in most cases, from the blood vessel point of things, when we look at the alterations in pressure, we'll see that vessels can either constrict or dilate. Constriction increases pressure. Dilation decreases pressure. Now let's look at it from another side, and that's the blood volume. Literally, the amount of blood in the system, if we put it a little bit more technically, can influence the pressure. Higher volume equals higher pressure. Lower volume equals lower pressure. Now, I kind of alluded to this back when we dealt with chapter 18, but the new aspect of this that we have to bring in is your heart and the cardiac output. The cardiac output is the amount of fluid being pumped into the system. So cardiac output has an influence upon pressure, because the higher the cardiac output, in theory, the higher the pressure should rise. The lower the cardiac output, the lower the pressure should be. Why is that? Because when the cardiac output is lower, literally you have less blood being pumped into the system. And therefore, with less blood, the pressure should drop. And when you have a higher cardiac output, you have more blood being pumped into the system. And with more blood, the pressure should rise. Now, also having an influence upon blood volume would be organs such as the kidney. Depending upon how much fluid they take out to produce urine or leave in your blood, well, the kidneys can affect it. So cardiac output is related to your pressure, because that's the amount of blood forced into the system, and that can alter the pressure. But we can't just completely eliminate the concept that blood pressure technically is due to your blood volume. And organs like your kidneys and even the process of bulk flow, which we talked about in the previous discussion, they can all have an influence on how much volume, literally, of blood that you have. So these determinants help determine your pressure. At the end of the day, that pressure, as I told you before, has to be high enough to overcome the resistance. The resistance is imparted primarily because of the vessels and their size. When we start to take a look at this, let's get the diagram or two down here. When we start to take a look at this resistance, the size of the vessels is one of the main determinants. Like I told you a few moments ago, the more contact a vessel has with the walls, more contact rather blood has with the walls of a vessel, the higher the resistance will go. So consequently, the vessel's radius or diameter or size, however you want to phrase that out, becomes one of the influences on the vascular resistance, or what I usually refer to as total peripheral resistance, or TPR. Total peripheral resistance rises when we have constricted vessels. That's because when those vessels constrict, in order to send the same amount of blood through them, more blood, by definition, has to contact the wall. As I told you kind of in the lead-in, when we have dilated vessels, all that blood moving through the center of the vessel, in other words, the blood not making contact with the wall, moves like the walls don't even exist. Therefore, that blood would not have or encounter any resistance. When we have that smaller vessel, more blood contacts the wall, and therefore the resistance goes up. Now, although the size of the vessels is a major determinant of the resistance, we also have to consider a couple of other items. Next, we would consider total blood vessel length. As I told you before, blood interacting, making contact with the wall of a vessel is one of the major players. But what if you just simply have more vessels? More vessels means more contact. More vessels and more contact with more blood equals a higher resistance. So when we look at situations where persons may be obese, because of the extra tissue, those people have additional blood vessels that are formed. Those additional vessels create added resistance as blood moves through them, and consequently, in order to overcome that resistance, typically that pressure has to rise. This is why we see a strong correlation between obesity and higher blood pressure or hypertension. It's because the additional vessels create more resistance, and that person's blood pressure would rise in response to this added resistance. The third and final influence we make mention of influencing TPR is going to be blood viscosity, the thickness of blood. A thicker fluid is just harder to move. I always tell people to just consider the time when you may drink a milkshake versus when you may drink a water or a regular soda through a straw. When you go to pull on that straw and you try to pull it and you're pulling the milkshake, you have to pull harder, more forcefully than you would if you had to pull when it was just water or a regular soft drink. This is because the thickness, the viscosity of that milkshake causes it to move slower The slower it moves, the more it interacts with the walls, and therefore the resistance that you encounter trying to pull the milkshake through the straw is greater. It's the same scenario when we consider the human body. That thicker blood, which usually is a result of a polycythemia, which is an increase in red blood cell number, that thicker blood imparted by polycythemia creates a slower moving blood which has more time to interact with the wall of the vessels and therefore increases the resistance. So these are your three influences upon total peripheral resistance, or TPR: blood thickness or viscosity, total blood vessel length, and also blood vessel radius or blood vessel diameter. If any of these is changed in a manner that increases vascular resistance, that means your arterial pressure, your blood pressure, basically has to go up. And you can see several ways in which your blood pressure can be altered, all of which are determined by an increased cardiac output. But at the end of the day, resistance, helps dictate pressure. Higher resistance means that by default you have to have a higher pressure because you have to maintain that same level of flow. Now when we look at blood flowing in the proper manner from arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules to veins, there's a reason why that occurs, and you should understand that as well. Remember, I told you in the lead into all this, physics says blood moves from areas of higher to lower pressure. So simply put, there's a higher pressure within the arterial division of your cardiovascular system, and that pressure will gradually decrease as you go from the arterioles, capillaries, venules to veins. In fact, by the time blood is returning to the right atrium, it's essentially under no pressure at all. It's basically zero. So why does blood move in the correct manner? It moves in the correct manner because simply the pressure decreases across those sets of vessels. Arteries have the highest pressure, followed in sequence by arterioles, capillaries, venules, and then finally veins. Now we mentioned the fact that veins in the lower extremities have to return blood to your heart. We call this concept venous return. Technically speaking, there's no pump, quote unquote, in your lower extremities to force your blood to flow back up toward your heart. Instead, your veins in your lower extremities get a little bit of help in order to return that blood by doing everyday normal actions. Those two actions are movement and also breathing. Now we technically define the pumps here as the skeletal muscle pump and also the respiratory pump. The skeletal muscle pump involves your everyday average movements, while the respiratory pump simply involves you breathing. What happens in the skeletal muscle pump is the muscles contract as you move. This puts pressure on the veins. Blood will then try to move in both directions, away from the heart and also toward the heart. As that blood moves away from the heart, the valve it should encounter a valve that closes, preventing the blood from moving in the wrong direction. But as it moves toward the heart, that proximal valve in this situation would open, allowing blood to continue to flow up toward the heart. When the muscle relaxes, the lower pressure will be created in the center of the vein here, allowing blood from behind the distal valve to begin to fill this section, while blood would try to move inferiorly from that now more proximal area, but the proximal valve should prevent that blood from being able to move in the wrong direction. So the skeletal muscle pump essentially milks blood back toward the heart as you accomplish your everyday common movements. The respiratory pump will do the same as it alters the pressure within your thoracic and also abdominal cavity when you normally breathe. So these two pumps, both the skeletal muscle and also the respiratory pump, are going to be involved in facilitating, once again here, venous return. Now we've kind of taken a look at a couple of different concepts. We talked a little bit here about pressure and resistance, and also just simply flow and venous return. Last item I kind of mentioned to you earlier was this concept of velocity or speed. And there's going to be different velocities associated with certain groupings of blood vessels. The way that your book will define it technically, and this is the way we always do it, we say that the velocity or speed of blood flow is inversely related to the total cross-sectional area of those vessels. What that means is that if we added up all the space that those vessels collectively took up, the more space a group of vessels collectively takes up, the lower the speed should be. The less space a group of vessels takes up, then the higher the speed should be. Now what happens is the vessels that take up the most space collectively are the capillaries, so their total cross-sectional area is the highest. So therefore, according to what we just said, their velocity of speed should be the lowest. And this makes some sense because it takes time for exchange to occur. You don't want the blood moving so fast that you don't have time for the capillaries to do their job, which is to accomplish exchange. So the velocity or speed of flow is lowest in the capillaries to allow for exchange. You'll see that the velocity or speed of flow is the highest through the arteries and arterioles, because the blood flowing through these two sets of vessels contains the nutrients. It does you no good if those nutrients are just within your arteries and arterioles only. There's no exchange that occurs until you reach the capillaries. So blood moves very quickly through the arteries and arterioles in an effort to reach the capillary level where exchange will occur. And then it slows down a little bit more through the veins, or rather it speeds up somewhat through the veins and venules, but it's never as fast as it is through the arteries and arterioles. And you can see also this would be a reason why that you have the veins and venules function as blood reservoirs. Blood is moving a little bit slower, there's a little bit more space, combine those two, and that allows these veins and venules to function as blood reservoirs. So these are some of the concepts related to hemodynamics. Like I said, hopefully by the end of this you kind of get how pressure is related to flow, how pressure also relates to resistance, and then this concept of velocity.